Hello everyone, today we're looking at practicing a Germany question. So how do we go ahead and answer this? Well, we know it's 11 marks, which means it'll take us about 11 minutes to complete, and we'll be answering using 4 paragraphs. We'll be provided with 2 sources. Typically it's one visual and one written source, but there's no guarantee on the exam. It could be 2 visual or 2 written. We'll be asked to decide which source is more useful, and we must use that statement. All sources are useful to historians. We must decide which one is more useful, and we'll analyze each source for their usefulness. In paragraph 1, we'll make a statement that both sources present useful information about the key feature in our question, and we will need to set a little bit of context. In our second paragraph, we'll look at source C, and we'll use the caption as well in our analysis. We'll set the context for the time period and explain who made the source, why they made it, and why this may be useful to an historian. We'll do the exact same thing for source D. Use the caption, set the context, explain who made it, why they made it, and why it might be useful. So now it's time to look at our sample question. We have the goose step. This is published in the British magazine called Punch, and we have source D, which is an extract of a speech by Hitler being delivered to the Reichstag in 1936. So we need to make sure we're using the caption to identify the goose step. Many of us in the past have made a mistake calling this a duck. We need to use the caption to make sure we're getting that information correct. We should also be linking to policies that we know of. In the background, we can see loads of Nazi flags with swastikas, so we should be linking this to Gleichschaltung. We should also be mentioning this as a clear example of Nazi propaganda because it's made by the British. They're attempting to make the Nazis look silly or unintelligent. And the fact that the goose is stepping on the Locarno Treaty shows us what the Germans interpreted peace as. It's certainly useful as it shows us what the British thought about the Rhineland. It also shows us that British people would assume Nazis were a bit of a joke. They had lots of weapons and support from those in the Rhineland. Looking at the reoccupation itself and the time period in which it's published, the reoccupation had just happened in March of 1936. So do the British have all the information they need to make an informed decision about that crisis? Having a look at source D, we'll go through, we'll make our quick notes about what Hitler is saying, but we have some questions that need answering. Now, we know the Rhineland was occupied in March, and this speech is written 7 months after the reoccupation of the Rhineland. We know that Hitler is lying, and we know he had no intentions on ever keeping the peace in Europe. And this was said to the Reichstag. Will Hitler actually tell the truth? And we have to keep in mind who works in the Reichstag. Are they Nazis, or are they going to be opposing Hitler?
Both sources are of varying usefulness to an historian studying the events in the Rhineland in 1936. In 1936 Hitler was continuing to break the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles by building his army, not paying reparations and sending his army into the demilitarized Rhineland. The Allies were all too happy to appease Hitler, hoping that a strong Germany would bring stability to Europe and avoid any further war. Source C is useful because it is a cartoon showing how Germans were willing to use force to reoccupy the Rhineland. It depicts the German goose stomping on the Locarno Pact, heavily armed but pretending to have peaceful intentions. There is obviously a degree of sarcasm in the cartoon, as can be seen in the poor-fitting helmet and the amount of weapons, as it was published in a British magazine. It is useful because it is a British view of the reoccupation and shows us what many British people would have thought about the Nazis reoccupying the Rhineland, and it is aimed at a British audience with the intention of warning against Germany's military ambitions. Source D is useful because it is an extract from a speech by Hitler given in the Reichstag a few months after the reoccupation. It is useful because he also reinforces the idea that the Locarno Pact was no longer valid, and he states that Germany has no more territorial demands in Europe. Source D is useful because it shows how Hitler was increasing in confidence, taking action against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but then appearing to be peaceful to the Reichstag, which were mostly Nazis, but also for an international audience. A historian would know that Hitler had no intention on keeping the peace. Source C is more useful for an historian studying the events of the Rhineland as it shows an outside perspective to the plans the Nazis had. Even though this is British propaganda, Source C shows the British view of the Rhineland and the wider military intentions of Hitler by destroying the Locarno Pact and reoccupying the lost territory.
So you've had a chance to look at a sample answer. Now it's time to practice the skill on your own. There will be 3 sample questions which will appear for about 10 seconds on screen. Please pause on the question that you wish to complete, write it down on your sheet of paper or in your exercise book, and be able to complete it then. Make sure that you answer the question in the time that is required. When you're finished, hit play on the video, which will reveal a mark scheme. Use that mark scheme to mark your own work. And lastly, you can play through the model answers at the end to double check that you have included all the relevant information.
Both sources show useful information about the Nazis' control over the legal system. Shortly after Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, he knew that he needed to ensure his control and power over Germany. After the passing of the Enabling Act and issuing oaths for students, soldiers and public servants, Hitler turned his focus to the control over the legal system. By doing this, Hitler could ensure that judges upheld Nazi values and maintained strict order when handing down sentences, extending the Nazis' control over Germany. Source C is a speech by Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Nazi Propaganda, making a speech to rich industrialists in 1935. This source is not particularly useful to an historian studying control of the legal system, as it focuses mainly on the importance of propaganda's influence and control of the upper class. It does tell us that the Nazis valued the elites in society, as they were the ones to steer the ship, but it does not tell us about control over the legal system. Source D is an explanation of the judge's role by Nazi legal expert Professor Karl Eckhart in 1936. It is unclear whether he is a Nazi himself, or an expert on the Nazis' laws, but what is clear is his expertise in the field. He says that the National Socialist ideology, Hitler's views, is the basis for how law should be interpreted. Furthermore, this source illuminates the need for all judges to have Nazi values, and ensure that all rulings in court are to safeguard the order of the racial community and keep the Nazis in control. Although both sources have merit, Source D is more useful to an historian studying the Nazi legal system as it has come from an expert in the field of law and supports the widely held belief that the Nazis used the legal system to extend their control over Germany. Both sources are of varying usefulness to an historian studying the Night of the Long Knives as they present information from different perspectives. Not long after Hitler became Chancellor in January of 1933, Hitler knew that his position was fragile. He needed secure control as soon as possible. He did have a large amount of influence over the population with the introduction of the Hitler Youth and effective use of propaganda and his essay. However, there were several individuals such as Franz von Papen, Roman Hindenburg who threatened to take power away from Hitler. In 1934, Hitler decided to take out his opponents in what was called Operation Hummingbird, or the Night of the Long Knives. In all, over 2 nights over 400 of Hitler's opponents were killed, leaving Hitler with full authority. Source C is useful because it shows the large number of Hitler's opponents who were killed in the Night of the Long Knives. It was created by a British cartoonist Sidney Strubb just 1 day after the event took place. Even though Strubb is British, the source presents the view that many British people had about Hitler. He was nothing to worry about, and this can be seen in the artist's depiction. Even though the image is an example of propaganda, it does show how people reacted to Hitler, and an historian must bear in mind that Strub created this image the next day, so Strub may not have had a lot of information to use when making his cartoon. Source D is useful to an historian, and as it shows the perspective of a banned social democratic newspaper. The newspaper is clearly not pleased with Hitler, nor with the fact ends to unfortunately gain prestige. It was written secretly within 1 month of the event, and the author remained anonymous as the article is critical of the Nazis. It says that people in Bavaria were pleased with Hitler, while many others in the country expressed dissatisfaction with the Nazis' brutal approach to seizing power. Source D is more useful to an historian because it shows that not all people in Germany were in support of the Nazis and their bid for power. It shows that many people in Germany reacted negatively to the Night of the Long Knives despite the support of some in Bavaria. Source C is slightly less useful, not because of the fact it was produced in Britain, but because it does not present anything new that an historian would not already be aware of in terms of the reactions of British people. An historian would certainly assume that British people would react negatively and poke fun at Hitler. Furthermore, I do wonder how Strub was able to find out about such a secret operation just 1 day after the event took place when most people in Germany had no idea, calling into question the quality of information Strub had about the true scale of the operation. Overall, Source D does present more useful information for an historian studying the reactions to the Night of the Long Knives. Both sources are of varying usefulness to an historian studying the role of the Gestapo. The Gestapo were Hitler's secret police force, responsible to investigating crimes against the Nazis, as well as locating and punishing those who stood up against Nazi rule. The Gestapo were famous for creating a state of fear and panic, as many families who openly defied the Nazis simply went missing. Source C is written by Heinrich Himmler and is a private letter to Hitler. Himmler is offering his advice as to how Hitler can achieve more power over the population, and this can be done by getting the support of the local police. Although Himmler was in charge of the SS, this source contains reliable information about the later scare tactics used by the Gestapo. The only way Hitler could control the entire population was to ensure that local police were following Nazi rules, and to encourage everyone to follow rules through fear of punishment. Source D is written by Jürgen Brunn in his diary in 1937. Brunn, who we assume is a German citizen, recorded his thoughts about the time he saw Hitler speak in Bamberg, and how captivating Hitler was. Brunn says he would do anything for Hitler, because of the work Hitler did to assist Germans during the Great Depression, such as establishing the Rad, Labor Front, and Hitler Youth. Many Germans favored Hitler's new policies as they did help to bring the Depression to an end. The Nazis created several work programs, as well as used invisible unemployment statistics to further promote their policies. However, Source D is not discussing the role of the Gestapo, as Brunn's support for Hitler was caused by his charismatic speech in Bamberg, and not the fear of the Gestapo. Source C is more useful to an historian studying the role of the Gestapo. Source C directly links to the Gestapo establishing a state of fear through their control over the local police forces. The Gestapo's job was to deal with those who do not listen and establishing full control in Germany,